the next slide was actually going to be going on to her Riverbank sampling and sediment core sampling results. And just to emphasize, before Josie starts at this, the goal, is to provide more information to all of you about the preliminary Riverbank and sediment sampling results, and to have space, for questions and discussion. So you can, Alyssa and I will be checking, your hands and the chat as Josie's going, but she's going to share her screen for this portion because she has some exciting things to share. And one thing I want to mention, because Cassie's on too, from the last meeting, March 31st, Cassie, you had brought up a question about showing, historic information kind of on top of the Riverbank and sediment core sampling information from last fall that was collected, and Josie's followed up on that piece. So you'll be seeing that in a bit. So Josie, go for it.
Okay. So I'm going to start with just reminding folks of where the samples were taken. And so when we think about, with the beach sampling, when we thought about the results of those beach sampling, we were comparing them to human health direct contact risk, right? And the sediment coring and the riverbank coring are for a different purpose. They're to really delineate where we have exceedances of our remedial action levels. Where are we going to take active cleanup measures? And we compared those concentrations to our in-water numbers, which are based on a fish consumption scenario. And because these contaminants bioaccumulate in fish, they're actually it's a different threshold. It's a lower threshold. So I'm going to put up some results that are going to make it look like there's red on the beach, but in part of that is just because it's a different comparison point, and this is kind of a different purpose of the sampling. So all the dots along here, these blue dots are where we took the in-water sediment cores, and then the orange dots are where we did the riverbank cores. And we approached them the same way, that we took cores down as deep as we could go, and then did analytical work on the 0 to 1 foot interval, the 4 to 5, the 9 to 10, and if it went deep enough, also the 14 to 15 foot interval. And so what I've done here, because I think this is how it's helping me to think about it, is color coded these different core locations. And so the red cores, where I've put a red circle on there, means that one of those intervals, one of those depth intervals came back with one or more of the contaminants above our remedial action level. Both the white and the green circles are showing places where those sediment cores came back, and none of the intervals had an exceedance of our remedial action level. The difference is the green ones, we have other information that led us to want more data. And so we are running more intervals in the green cores. And typically this is done because we have historic subsurface data that showed an exceedance. So like this is a classic example right here. Is this big enough for folks to see?
I think if you could zoom in a little bit, it might help.
Yeah, okay. Let me just try to do that. I'm going to try to make it.
You can in the bottom right hand. Yeah, you got it. Or yeah, you got it.
There. Is that better?
It's much better.
So here's a classic example where both this sediment core and this sediment core, all the intervals that we ran came back below our remedial action levels. But we have these two historic cores right there that were above our remedial action levels. And so we're going ahead and running more cores, more intervals here to make sure that we're not missing something. Often the historic data was done in longer intervals. There are 3 foot, 4 foot, 5 foot mixes in those samples. And so the samples that we're doing as part of remedial design, because they're 1 foot intervals, are going to give us much more granular information about what's down there. So I'm going to pause for a moment and let this all sink in. I think one thing that's interesting that's come out is the different parts of the SMAs have different contaminants that are driving those areas. So down here, this is DDX that's down here. This is mainly dioxins. This lens here, and oh no. And all in here is a mixture of PCBs and dioxins and PAHs. Over here where we hit a bunch of wood chips as we were trying to sample, that also has a mixture of different contaminants. What's driving the shoreline along the BES lab is mainly PCBs. And then these cores are mainly dioxins. And here's another example where we're running more cores. They came back clear, but we really want to make sure that if we do trim where we do active cleanup in the sediment management area, we want to really be sure that it's the right thing to do.
So just a couple of things before Marcus goes. So when you say, can you just clarify again what you mean by remedial action level?
So that's the level, the cleanup decision was to actively clean up contamination above a remedial action level for all the contaminants, and then allow natural attenuation to continue to pull down those concentrations site-wide until we reach our long-term cleanup levels. And so that remedial action level is the level at which we take an active cleanup, either capping or dredging.
Thank you. And then SMA.
That's a sediment management area. And so that's the area that is defined by remedial action level exceedances, where we will do that, design an active remedy. And so what you can see in this is that we have not fully delineated the sediment management areas for Cathedral Park, either one, right? We're going to need to do step out sampling here to make sure that we get to the clean edge. And probably out here.
What does step out sampling mean?
It's where you take, so like if we marched out another 150 feet and took another sediment core, that would be a step out, because we're stepping out, kind of marching out beyond our existing, where we know the active cleanup needs to happen to find where the edge of that contamination is, where it drops below our remediation thresholds.
Thanks. Marcus, and then Cassie.
I think you largely just answered my question, because I was looking just east of the bridge at T22 to T23, where you have this really steep, a little bit farther to the right.
Over here.
The other way. So T22, so right above analytical and the green in the descriptions.
Analytical right here, yes.
Yeah,
yep.
Exactly. So then if you go a little bit to my right of that, maybe your left, you have like this steep decline with these contour lines, the light green lines, which show the river's deeply, I imagine, declining, like getting deep really quick.
Yeah.
So, and then along the rest of them, like you're right on the edge of that. So I think you answered my question. You'll go out into that area.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Marcus. And Cassie.
Is EPA sort of keeping current on like research about natural attenuation and its effectiveness based on different contaminants, and how, with findings from, 5-year reviews across different sites? Is that information disseminated across different regions, and whether it works or not? Because it seems like, there's so much skepticism in the community around that type of methodology. But it'd be great to know, after 5 and 10 and 15 and 20 years, like, is it doing anything? And what does it mean to just lower the levels? Hope that the levels lower over time.
Yeah, that's a good point. We are, so, here for sure, we're going to continue to do 5-year reviews. Like we've set that baseline, that really robust baseline sampling effort that was done in 2018, that we'll be able to repeat every 5 years or so and understand what's happening with the trend lines in our site. But I think you're also bringing up the point, like, have we learned things from other sites, right? And whether we have reason to believe this actually will work. And we do, we're confident about capping PCBs. That's worked repeatedly across the country, as well as these other contaminants. And also what we've seen the other project area I work on a lot is Terminal 4. And so we're seeing the new surface level data that we're seeing come in there does show that things are starting to attenuate. I think that the baseline sampling also showed that they're not fully attenuating on their own. We still need to go do active cleanup, but we are starting to see levels start to come down, just on, with the natural movement of the river, and because we've done a lot of source control work in the harbor.
But do you all know where it goes or what happens to it, why it's going down?
Oh, like the exact mechanism? I don't think we're doing that level of research. You need to like differentiate what's natural degradation versus what's stuff just getting mixed around and dispersed, and what's kind of clean sediment coming in on the top.
McCormick and Baxter just did their.
Wait, sorry, Doug, wait 1 second. Just,
Okay.
is that what you meant, Cassie? Just what Josie just clarified?
I was just curious if it's, if it's legit, if it's, EPA thinks it's all good, if it's like just floating upriver toward the Columbia River, if you're cool with that.
I think in order to stop sediment from flowing down the river, that's
Sounds like maybe
Can't do it.
But it's because I know you've talked to the Hudson team a lot, Josie, and they're further ahead, at least on part of their project than us. So it might just be, I'm sure this question has come up there in some of the spaces they have. It might just, we have check-ins with them periodically. So
Mhm.
we can
Because
bring this up
they're
there.
using a fish consumption, they're using fish tissue measure as their metric, which is proving to be more challenging than sediment concentrations. But I think what we're trying to do is lower the concentration that fish encounter, and so in that way, letting some of this stuff disperse down beyond the site is a reasonable way to mitigate that risk.
I think we should think just a little bit more about how to explain that, because it does, what you said makes sense, Josie. I just think it does, maybe there is like some examples from like the Hudson or others.
Yeah, we should
kind of thought
maybe
about
talk with them about it. Yeah, that'd be interesting.
Doug?
So McCormick and Baxter, they've got 25 years in after the actual cleanup. So is there any indication that contamination levels have been declining beyond where it was cleaned up to? The monitored natural recovery sort of thing, is that actually improving the situation beyond the initial cleanup?
I can look into that. What I understand about the remedy is that it was a cap, so I'm not sure that it had a M&R component to it. Do you know, Laura? Or
Well, once the cap's in place, that anything that changes from there on is basically whether you monitor it or not. But that's always something that people have been skeptical about, is the whole theory. But it'd be interesting to know if the river is cleaner now than it was when they did the initial cleanup. Whether it's bleeding out from underneath the cap or out in front of it or whatever.
Yeah, we can certainly circle back with that project team. I don't have the answer right this moment.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, we coordinate with them too. And we'll again, Cassie, with your questions, circle kind of back on that the next time we convene too. Josie, I don't think there's any other hands right now, but
yes, I have a question. Sorry.
Sorry, Laura.
I just wondered, is the outflow pipe that Doug was talking about visible on this map?
It's right here. See that little gray circle with the X?
Yeah.
That's one of them. And then the other one is like over on this bank right here in this
Wow.
area.
Interesting. I didn't know that, Doug, until you brought that up. I thought everything went into the big pipe. Funnily enough. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. And Francisca, thanks for putting a little more information in the chat about Cassie's question about that your understanding is NNA does take into account sediment deposition, but we'll follow up more too. Other questions for Josie before she has more slides, right? No? Oh, I thought you had another one on here.
No, this is, I've completed my prepared remarks. I'm just ready for the questions.
So can you just clear? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Marcus, and then I can.
Oh, I didn't put my hand up, so it's fair.
That's
I was
okay.
just going to say, I mean, maybe one thing is like, I know you all do a lot of conceptual diagrams, so maybe there's a role for like a graphic about MNA, monitor natural attenuation.
But
Some of it goes
yeah.
down, some of it gets deposited on top of. I know Laura, has been exploring this air issue, so maybe there's a role for that, like a really clear graphic of that. And I don't know if like ITRC or ITRC is like a group of other agencies that do a lot of work around Superfund and environmental remediation, and they tend to kind of collect like best practices or like lessons learned from other sites. So maybe they have a role, they have some more information on that too.
Good idea, Marcus. Thank you. I think you went over this pretty well, Josie, but just kind of going back to what we kind of brought up at the last meeting, the historic sampling versus what we collected in 2021. Can you just again just kind of clarify this graphic on how that on where the like historic sampling was versus like what the samples we took?
Yeah, so let me, I think this is an easier one. It doesn't have my complicated circles on it, but what you're looking at here, all the red and white dots are historic samples, and the larger icons are the subsurface samples, and the smaller icons were surface samples that were collected. And so, which is why you can see like there was a massive data gap over here, right? We had almost no subsurface data. And so when we did when we went to do our sediment cores, we really needed much more granular data to do a design than you do to get a general sense of where the contamination is. And so that's why we just went with a basic kind of a grid sense of cores rather than trying to react to the existing data we had. We just put out a grid to kind of carpet the area that we knew was a concern as an initial step. But then when we're thinking about what do we do with all these intervals we have that are archived, then we went back and looked at where we knew there was historic contamination to make sure that we filled in our understanding of those areas as best as we can. And then as I mentioned, so that was the initial, or what we think of as our initial sampling effort. We're doing a tier 2 of analytical, but it is going to inform a second field event. And so we're going to come back out with a different kind of technology. So these cores were taken with a vibrocore, where you vibrate the tube down in. We are probably going to come back with a sonic coring rig, which is just a much more powerful version of that. And it actually drives a metal core into the ground, and it does it with a heavier, it's just a bigger, more powerful piece of equipment. And so that should allow us to get into some of these, hopefully we'll be able to get into some of these areas and to drive further down. Like some of these cores, I think 33, we only got down maybe 5 feet. So we want to be able to drive further in some of these areas. Does that answer your question, Laura? Is that what you're hoping I would talk about?
Yeah, I think that's good. And I think just when is that going to happen? Like what are the next steps for doing those additional, because when you say field event, you mean going out and doing more sampling with these step outs, right?
Mhm.
So what does that look like?
It looks like kind of understanding the data that we already have and thinking through what our next, something called a basis of design report, where you think about the things you know about your area and the things you need to understand in order to do that actual engineering design. And then, so kind of figuring out what our data gaps are and then doing another field event. And so I think probably for this project area, that second field event will happen sometime in 2023.
Cassie?
I don't recall the reasoning why, behind why you didn't do samples on T10 and T9, kind of higher up on the shore, close to the shoreline.
Where are T10 and T9?
Yeah, over there, like North Markham,
Oh,
North Shoreline.
it wasn't where, so at this stage, we're taking areas where we know there is contamination and further delineating those areas. And based on the RI data and the FS data, that we thought the sediment management area ended here. And so we're stepping out from where the known contamination is rather than kind of going into the other areas where we don't think there's a problem.
But are you stepping out, Josie, like right over there? I mean, so where Cassie was saying, because there are two reds there. So
Mhm.
where will you be stepping out? You'll be going.
Well, what's interesting here, these are dioxin exceedances in the top foot, but below that it was clean or below our remedial action levels. So I think it's too soon for us to say exactly where we're going to go based on this information. Like, we need to get back the tier 2 data and get a better understanding of what it is that we're really dealing with.
Well, there's a lot of interest in having river access for people at North Markham site.
Mhm.
So it would be super helpful to know the level of contamination at the edge of the river there. And especially since there's concerning levels, it seems like just
So
next.
this whole area was actively cleaned up by the Port of Portland. We don't, just because there's not dots there, this data set only shows the in-river sediment data. Just because there's not marking there doesn't mean there isn't sample results. I'm pretty sure this area, we know that this area, this riverbank is fine because it was part of that.
That's something we can double check before
Yeah,
the
totally.
next meeting.
Yeah.
It'd be helpful to get that information on here then.
We'll follow up on that.
It
before
would be
the-
helpful. It's not data that we have in a database because it was done under a DEQ order, and so it's we will find out. I hear you about the need to communicate it. I'm not sure if the best way is going to be to kind of update this map with those data points, but we'll think about how to make that part of the story we can tell.
We can at least look into it and provide an update before by our next check-in. But that's a good point, Josie, so that because the tier 2, so this is like what Josie said, like we're not even sure, or Josie's not even sure, where the step outs are going to be exactly for some of these, because she's waiting on getting additional information back from the lab on the cores themselves. And so that's, but we wanted to show you this early. And when is the tier 2 information, Josie? When will you be getting, or do we think we'll be getting that back?
It has just started trickling in, and we think it will come in over the next 3 months. We sent off the final round to the lab last week. So the lab doesn't want all 500 samples at once, right? So we've been kind of sending them out in batches so as not to overwhelm the lab. So we're running the analytical for us.
So our next working group meeting, we can kind of see, we can let you know what we're seeing as they come back. Other questions from anyone on what Josie's saying?
Doug's raising his hand.
Physically, where is the lab that you're dealing with at? What kind of transportation issues do the cores go through?
They go, some are down on the Gulf Coasts. One is on the East Coast somewhere. And I think one is in California. And then one is the EPA Manchester lab in Puget Sound.
Wow, no wonder it takes so long.
Yeah. Well, they'd have to ship them overnight because these are frozen samples they're receiving in order to maintain holding times. You know, if we had archived them just refrigerated, they would have exceeded their holding times. The lab would have said they've been in the refrigerator too long. These aren't trustworthy samples anymore. So in order to allow us to do this staged analytical, we had to freeze all the samples. So they get
They
shipped
probably
overnight.
fly then,
They
right?
do. Yep.
Thanks.
They're all great questions, everyone. Thank you. Other questions? Including if, you know, what Josie said isn't making sense. You don't have to let us know in this space in front of everyone, but if you do, that would be helpful. But you can let us know offline too, or let me know offline, and we can do, you know, we can talk to you more too. But I was wondering, and then we can move on to the last bit and maybe let folks go early too, is based on, you know, because all of this is preliminary, you know, information that we're sharing. And so if, you know, kind of like what Marcus suggested earlier about creating a graphic for M&A, even though that's, you know, different than what we're talking about right here, but that's, you know, if there are other ways or other graphics, like what Cassie suggested last time, that historical comparison, which we kind of tried to do here, and Josie did. If there are other ways that we could present this information that you think could be useful, especially as we think about some kind of larger event, you know, in the fall potentially, let us know. And if that's, you know, and also for this working group, if there are ways that you would like to see this information, maybe in a different way, or would love to know that so we can work, Josie and I can work on that before our next meeting. So I'll just put that out there. Any thoughts on that right now?
I will offer a thought. I don't feel that this is very user friendly, honestly. I have to go like this, you know. I don't feel like I have a good composite understanding. I don't know. I mean, I understand its usefulness for a certain precision, but maybe something honestly a little vaguer, a little more colorful swaths of, I don't know. I'm tired. Maybe that's why I'm not enjoying this map so much.
Well, it's 6:45. It's like dinner time. Yeah.
I don't know. I wonder. I mean, I think it's certainly something to explore for the general public. This is not, I think, not very user friendly. That's what I'll say.
Thanks. No, that's helpful. Very helpful. We can think about how to present this a little differently. Does anyone else have thoughts on that, Marcus?
Yeah, I was thinking along the same similar lines to Laura, and I'm wondering, there's like a number of components in here that are, maybe they're not important, but like one thing is I'm curious if it's feasible to do like an interpolation. Like, does it make sense to like all the little green ones near the city of, you know, near the beach area that are green, or does it like make sense to have like a blob of green? Or is that disinformation, is like one question. And then the other piece is that like really came up to me is like, well, you do have areas that are, you know, more aligned with certain contaminants, and that's not as clear here. So if that's something you'd like to communicate to the public, it might make sense to just have 4 different maps, one for like high levels of DDX, one for like high levels of PCBs, just to kind of, and say like, these are the areas of where we're really, I don't know if concerned is the right word, but we're concerned, and, you know, this is the focus area, just so people, if they look at the map right away, they can say, oh, I see. So here's where the PCBs are really high. Here's where it's like a really big mix of everything. And then here's where it's like some other contaminant. So that's just maybe one way to follow up on Laura's thoughts.
Thanks,
And is that
Marcus.
interesting, or is it just like, are folks more interested in just like where are there high enough levels of contamination that you're going to take action? Like, that's part of the thing I've been struggling with a little bit when I think about what to communicate. It's like, I think which contaminants is very interesting, but I'm like way more down in the weeds.
Why
And
don't
if
we
it's
do
just
a
like
quick
a non-issue, if it just
Alyssa,
creates-
Yeah, Alyssa, I mean, we can keep talking about that, I think. So Alyssa, so the question is, Josie, if you can do a quick poll, Alyssa, is if folks are interested in seeing more information about the specific contaminant distribution on this map with the riverbank and sediment cores, or what's the second option, Josie?
just like either yes, it's above our remediation action levels, or no, it's not. Right.
In general, yeah, being more clear about that.
Mhm.
Or both. That can be the third option. So Alyssa, and if you can make it so.
First option one more time. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. We're putting you on the spot. Thank you. It's if people would like to see specific distribution of contaminants in this graphic, or a more just, general, like more clear, is it above our remedial action level or below, or both? And people can select both. Jessica, and don't close it yet, because I think Jessica and Doug might have a couple. Jessica.
Yeah, I just had a quick question. So you were asking about for ideas. I just want to make sure I understood the question correctly. You were asking for ideas for how to present information at an event. Is that correct? At the event in the fall? Is that what you were referring to sort of have that?
That is what I was referring to. Yeah. And then I was kind of conflating it with just this graphic as something that we could continue kind of working on as we get more information to eventually show in the fall. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess my question, so kind of going that, so is it helpful to sort of weigh in on that at this point, or not to weigh in on that about the
Yeah,
event?
you can weigh in on it.
I guess my question is sort of like, what thinking about like, is the purpose of that event to more share like what came out of it, to share what the process is, to share, just to kind of think about like what ultimately is the communication goal there, and using that as kind of the guide to figure out, the types of information that are going to be provided, and if it's going to be something that is more public, like, right, like so folks in this space are really like into this and have really like know this stuff, understand it, and ask questions, right, and are super engaged in it. And I guess my question is sort of like, is the goal of the event in the fall something that is more to sort of like cast a wider net to sort of bring people in, so there's something that could be to make the information accessible, and there's sort of an entry point for folks no matter kind of where you are in your sort of your super fund knowledge spectrum, you know what I mean? So those are just some things that I would suggest considering.
Thank you. And I think that's really helpful. And I think the answer, which we'll talk, that's a good segue after Doug and Mark go, is that we did want to, when we talked about the goals of that in-person event with this working group in the past, it was to make it more broadly accessible versus having it kind of be for folks who are very, very much tracking this. So that's a really good point. So a graphic like this may not be as helpful even if we made it a little more accessible. So that's a very good point. Doug, and then Mark, and then we'll do the poll.
So one of the things that surprised me when Josie went through the sample locations the first time is they seem to be segregated by contaminant more than I expected. An area, a good size of the PCBs would be here, and dioxins and other things in other places, where I expected them to all be kind of jumbled together. So
They are in places. And I'm giving kind of like a broad brush because I think it's interesting, but not to, don't assume that none of them are co-located. Just
okay,
I mentioned certain
that works.
driven by certain things.
That's a good point of clarification, Doug, and thanks, Josie. Mark.
Oh, that was a mistake. Thank you. I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem.
Thank you. Okay.
Let's go ahead and take that poll just to see in terms of this group in this space. Ignore for now what I said about using this graphic at the fall event because this might be a little much. But maybe not. Like what that's one of the things we're workshopping things in this space with all of you, so we can kind of see if it would be applicable to some degree. But for our next meeting, some information for Josie, to kind of help make this information more accessible and present it in a more understandable way. Let's go ahead and take that poll.
I'm launch it
Alyssa.
right now.
Thank you.
And just while folks are filling out the poll, Marcus, we are going to do some interpolation work, which is where we kind of look at the concentrations that we found and estimate where we think the different concentration gradients are in this area. But we're not going to even think about that until we get back this next round of samples. But we will do some interpolating to think about where to do the next round of samples. So I think that's something you can look forward to seeing, in probably in the basis of design report.
Yeah, I was thinking more kind of Laura Feldman's question about like, how do you make it easier to read, like when you see it real quick,
Totally, right? If we could just kind of draw a circle,
Right.
yeah, delineate the sediment management area.